Great. Well, I think we'll make a move and anybody else is welcome to come in late. So first, we've got two presentations, and the first of which will be Rehan from Bournemouth University in the United Kingdom, speaking to this topic here. Thank you very much.
Hi, so my name is Rehan. I'm a lecturer in visual effects, film visual effects at Bournemouth University, and I'm doing a PhD, which I have to submit in the next month's time, which looks at high dynamic range landscape photography. So dynamic range is basically the contrast difference between the brightest point in the scene and the darkest point in the scene. And it's measured in exposure values.
Sorry, do you mind if you shut that door? There's yapping right outside the door.
Right, so dynamic range, contrast difference between the brightest point and the darkest point in the scene. And it's measured in units called exposure values. And an exposure value is basically the amount of light that goes through the lens and is recorded by the camera. Increasing the exposure value by 1 unit actually doubles the amount of light that is recorded, and decreasing it by 1 unit reduces the amount of light to half. Okay. So here what we've got is the middle value, which is at 0 eV, and increasing the exposure by 2 actually quadruples the light that comes through, that is recorded. Okay. So our eyes can see about 16 stops of light, right? And it's a logarithmic curve, it's not a linear curve. These cameras, DSLRs, can usually record about 13, or they're advertised as such. When you start pushing and pulling pixels around, the amount of useful stops that you usually, or exposure values that you usually get, is closer to 5 or 6. In a real-world outdoor scene, on a sunny day, under high contrast, the exposure values can be over 22 PVs at times. So one method of actually capturing this entire range of values is to take a range of different exposures, and then which can collectively capture the entire range, and then blend them together to generate one large file, which is a 32-bit file, from which you can then extract whatever details, whatever values you need. Which is kind of what I've done here. So here you can see these are 5 different exposures, 2 exposure values apart, and then they've been blended together to create one image that has good detail in the sky, good detail in the ground and in the shadow areas, right? So McCann has described how painters, given the limited reflectance of paints, had to use the human visual system to create high dynamic range scene appearances. So what they're doing is basically painting what they perceive rather than the actual radiance of light at that particular point. There was no attempt to reproduce scene radiances, and the painter's ground truth is the appearance of the image. Similarly, Ansel Adams never used scene radiances, but actually used his mastery of technical photography to render his aesthetic intent. McCann also suggests that the same theory applies to many examples of HDR photography. Multiple exposures capture different spatial records of the HDR scene, and by combining the highest contrast portion of multiple exposures with desirable lookup tables or the creative intent, you can basically create what he calls the example of painter's technique. And that's what I've used. So this is not about precision, it's about achieving that creative intent. And for me, this has very much been about that classical landscape oil painting look in the 18th and 19th century. So the kind of works I'm referencing, or the look I'm referencing, is John Constable, Turner, and so And Tortellini has described the main shared features between works created by the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and high dynamic range photography as being colored shadows. So the shadows actually have color in the surface. Color in the shadows, colored shadows, the light itself, and the color of the light, plus the color of the surface within the shadow. Low global contrast, high local contrast, so less contrast between the sky and the ground, but within elements and their edges, you have a higher level of contrast. High color saturation and well-represented reflections of light and color. In order to better match the look to the kind of oil paintings that I'm referencing, all scene elements also need to be in focus. So paintings in that time at least didn't have shallow depth of field. Everything from the foreground to the background is in focus. It needs also to be free of any kind of camera or lens or the high dynamic range process artifacts, which can be noise, chromatic aberrations, vignetting, distortion from the lens, diffraction, localized halos, ghosting, and misalignments, which I'll come to. So usually, that's the kind of look you see, and that's, there's a whole genre now around it. It's known as urban porn. And HDR, so you have very dividing opinions on HDR. So under the classical landscape genre, people don't like this kind of look. But at the same time, there's more of the kind of rebellion group that goes for this. The problem is, these are just two extremes, right? And I feel by categorizing or dictating the kind of look it should be, we've kind of limited ourselves, and we're not exploring all the possible opportunities and the looks that are out there. So here we have an issue with localized halos, and that's just part of the process. So when you're blending exposures together, what the algorithm does is it makes, wherever there is, it makes the darker surfaces appear slightly more dark and the lighter surfaces appear slightly more lighter. And what you end up with sometimes is this kind of localized halo effect.
Who's the artist that's doing these? These are really cool.
Sorry?
Who's the artist that's doing these?
These?
Yeah.
That's me.
Well, that's you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, all the images are mine. This was more of a study than an actual picture. But you can see, so you've got defocusing here in the foreground, which doesn't really lend itself to the kind of look I'm trying to create. Similarly, like I said, enhancing or basically upping the contrast in where the edges are. You can actually see the detail in the picture in this part of the tree trunk, but not further up, it starts to get dark. So one solution is actually blending it with a different exposure. Again, localized halos, slight localized halos around the top of the trees. But one of the things I really liked about HDR was the fact that not only does it blend and give you this high dynamic range when you tone map, you actually get this feel of oil paint because of the softening the softening effect that you get. So here, this is, again, you can see the street lights have come on, so this is more like twilight. But because of the HDR process, I'm able to extract details in some of the shadow areas, not all of them. You still have darker areas there, but we still have sections that are out of focus. Again, high contrast day, this would not be possible capturing this in a single exposure, in a single photographic exposure. Similarly, indoor-outdoor contrast can be quite wide. So this is Cambridge, about 45 minutes from where I live. So I live in Bournemouth, and it's like Vancouver. It's by the beach. It's the warmest part of the UK. Everything is 45 minutes away, just like here. I think it's 15 here, the lakes and the mountains. Anyway. The other problem is, of course, you are taking a series of images from the brightest to the darkest. Things move. So there's a whole challenge of how do you avoid that? How do you avoid that ghosting? and people move. But what I really like about this is the way the kind of fabric has come out. It has that kind of very painterly look. This is Corfe Castle train station nearby. So this is the road where I live. And again, the reference for the sky, the colors were beautiful. I have, of course, manipulated this, so increase the contrast, increase the saturation. I don't try and do kind of any, I don't take anything out of the image except for dust spots, things like that. So any scene elements that are there were actually there. They haven't been taken out. So this is again